With a single sheet of parchment and 56 signatures, America began the greatest political and spiritual journey in human history. Welcome to Freedom Alive. This year we celebrate the most important milestone in our country's history. And in light of the 250th anniversary of America, it's so important that we understand the faith of those founders who sacrificed everything to sign the Declaration of Independence. David Barton is the founder of WallBuilders and knows the facts about the signers that you've probably never heard. In other words, the truth about America you have never been told. I'm blessed to be joined again by my friend and co-host Matt Staver from Liberty Counsel. And Matt, many academics deliberately ignore, change, and revise the facts of history in order to better suit their own agendas. But we must learn the facts about America's history so we can preserve the truth for future generations.
Absolutely, and I'm very excited about David Barton. He is an expert on the founding era of America, and what a better guest that we could have than David Barton to talk about America 250th anniversary. So he has an amazing library in Texas. Some of the documents that he has the only ones in the entire world. Even he has documents that the Smithsonian doesn't have. It's amazing how he has compiled some of these documents as he's prayed and been able to find some of these historical documents that no one else has in the world. Amazing. So he is very well versed to talk about the incredible history of America, and what a history it is. In our DNA, we are founded, as the Declaration of Independence says, with the belief that there's a God who created us, and that in creating us, he endowed us with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that gave this unique perspective and birth to this American experiment that now is 250 years old.
Amen. I couldn't agree more about having David back as a guest on Freedom Alive. I think this is our third time, and this is going to be a remarkable episode. We cannot wait to bring it to you, but Liberty Counsel's Freedom Alert is next.
Florida Attorney General sues to protect children. The Florida Attorney General, James Uthmire, sued 3 major medical associations for misleading public opinion and deceptive practices regarding irreversible gender procedures on children. The lawsuit against the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, the Endocrine Society, and the American Academy of Pediatrics. The state requests the court levy a civil penalty of $1 million against each organization, bar them from future misleading advertising, and impose a $10,000 penalty for each false claim they have made regarding the safety, efficacy, and reversibility of these procedures. Medical organizations have a responsibility to ensure that the standards of care they promote are grounded in sound science and transparency. This case is about protecting the vulnerable children from irreversible medical interventions.
Up next, Matt's interview with David Barton.
I'm pleased to welcome a very special guest and friend, David Barton, the founder of WallBuilders, which is a national pro-family organization that is dedicated to educating people about America and our biblical founding principles. Welcome to Freedom Alive, David.
Hey, good to be with you, Matt. Appreciate all you do, brother.
Well, this is the 250th year anniversary of the founding of America. We couldn't have a better guest than you to talk about the founders and their Christian religious beliefs and how their values and their beliefs actually gave birth to this amazing experiment that now has been in existence for 250 years. Tell us a little bit about some of the founders.
You know, even before I do that, Matt, I want to just kind of drive home what you just said about the 250th. Just to put that in perspective, there was a big study done by the University of Chicago, Illinois, and they went through and said, all right, 5,800 years recorded history. What's the average length of a governing document in the history of the world? And it's 17 years. And we're sitting here at 250. I mean, we're so used to what we've had that we just think it'll go on forever. Nobody's ever done what our founding fathers have done in giving us a document that survived 250 years. So that's the first thing, is this is not just a birthday celebration. This is a global celebration that's never happened in the history of the world, and we need to appreciate that. So I think that's a starting place. And then as I look even back, and you mentioned the signers, one of the interesting things about the signers is people think about the signers, or they know the picture of the signing of the Declaration. And one of the things that we find really interesting is, okay, you think you know the signers, but we speak at a lot of universities, a lot of different settings, and we will put up a picture of the signers of the Declaration, the same one that hangs in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. And we offer a gift card for anyone who can identify 5 names on that picture. We've had the same gift card for 9 years. So people that think they know the founders, and they really don't know the founders. And as you get into them individually, they are quite amazing people, quite amazing stories.
So, when you began by saying there's no other nation in the world that has existed with a single government for 250 years, and you think about all the nations throughout history, certainly we have the longest surviving constitution of any nation in the world, but also really the single government. We haven't had multiple governments under the name United States, where many nations, they have multiple governments even today.
Yeah, the stability is just unrivaled. And I think that in our case, America has received so many blessings. We just kind of project that on the world and assume that this is kind of the normal condition. This is not the normal condition. What we have is there's just not enough superlatives to describe what we have. I cannot imagine France is a good example. And France had a revolution after we did. And they've gone through 15 separate constitutions in the same period of time we've had one. South Korea's had 6 since they declared independence back in the 40s after World War II. So just even our friendly nations, even those nations we think of as allies, they've never been able to come close to what we have here. And so for us to kind of play around the fringes with disregarding the Constitution or ignoring the Declaration or saying the Declaration, and this is the other big thing I find, particularly with leaders and academics, is no. Our governing document, it's the Constitution. It's not the Declaration. And we've seen that at least 3 times through our history. As you go back in the 1830s and 40s, particularly the slave owners that were in Congress said, hey, you guys keep talking about the right to liberty in the Declaration. That's not our governing document. We took an oath to uphold the Constitution, not the Declaration. And then we heard the same thing again with Roe v. Wade in the 60s and 70s. They said, look, you guys keep telling us about this right to life, and it's just not in the Constitution. That's in the Declaration. We took an oath to uphold the Constitution. And then we heard the same thing with Obergefell when we talked about marriage being natural law and laws of nature and nature's God. And they said, don't quote the Declaration to us. We uphold the Constitution. You can't do the Constitution without the Declaration. Article 7 makes that really clear. It's interesting that every single president up to right now, when they sign constitutional acts, they date those acts to the Declaration, not the Constitution. Trump signs acts, they're dated to 1776. And so those acts will say in the 250th year of the United States of America. They don't say in the 239th year. So it's interesting that from the beginning, our founders dated the Constitution to the Declaration. The Constitution won't work without the Declaration. And that's the thing I think really has gotten away from us. People see the Constitution as a governing document, and it is. But the Declaration is the values document. It's just the values for which the Constitution must work. And when you separate the Constitution from the Declaration and eliminate the Declaration, you make this government very unsuccessful. We start looking like other governments in the world. And it's the value system that's made us so different.
Yeah, it's the value system that really makes us different, that we believe that there's a God who's a creator, and he endowed us with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And government's duty is to protect those pre-existing God-ordained, God-given rights. I want to give a plug for WallBuilders for you and Cheryl, your wife, and your son, Tim, because you have such an amazing organization with original founding documents, some of which even the Smithsonian Institution does not have. You have some of the only documents in the entire world where you have prayed and the Lord has miraculously led you and Cheryl to discover some of these documents. David, with that, I know you are more versed on American history than anybody that I know. What about our founding fathers? You know, a lot of times people will focus on, say, Jefferson or maybe Benjamin Franklin and say, well, they were deists. What do you say to that? What kind of thing were our founding fathers believing, thinking, that ultimately gave birth to the Declaration that gave birth to our country?
Well, you're exactly right about Jefferson and Franklin. People think they know them, and they don't even know those two. And that's usually the only two that people get when we put that picture of 56 signers up there. They say, well, there's Jefferson and there's Franklin, and it gets real quiet after that. And so it's interesting. They have been taught to identify what they have been, or what many consider to be the two least religious founding fathers. But I will emphasize that the word least is a comparative term. They may have been the least religious of those two, but I want to hit something you said, because you said it perfectly to set up whether you knew it or not, and that's Franklin is a deist. And I hear that all the time. And how do you know Franklin's a deist? Well, he's a deist. How do you know? Okay, let me give you some help, because you don't seem to know what you think you know. Go to Franklin's autobiography, and in his own autobiography, he says he became a deist. And he said when he was 15 years old, he read a debate, he listened to a debate between several Christian ministers and several deists. And he said the deists just basically mopped the floor with the Christian ministers. And he said, so I decided to become a deist. And he said, and a week and a half later, that was the dumbest idea I'd ever come up with. He was a deist for a week and a half. And that's in his own. He said, I soon abandoned that philosophy as having no benefit to me and no use to any others. So he's a deist for a week and a half in his own autobiography, and people think he's a deist today. Not by any way, shape, fashion, or form would we consider him to be a deist in the classical sense of the term. So it's interesting whether he's a Christian or not. Late in life, a very evangelical Christian guy asked him, the president of Yale University said, look, I'm a Christian. I've been a Christian. I've never asked you. We've been friends for decades. Are you a Christian? And Franklin said, I've never given that any thought. I don't know. He said, I don't want to say yes or no until I investigate. But if you look at Franklin and what he did, he is the guy who really helped sponsor the preacher that did so much of changing America, George Whitefield. He actually built an addition onto his house for Whitefield to stay with him when he came anywhere in that part of the country. He is the guy who personally published Whitefield's sermons distributed in all the United States. The guy knew more about the gospel than most pastors today do, but he was very cautious on saying he was Christian. So we can say, well, he didn't profess to be a Christian, and he's the only one out of the 56 that did not profess to be a Christian openly. The other 55 did openly profess to be Christians. And so the nonsense of calling them atheists, agnostics, deists is pretty ridiculous. One of the things you mentioned, the collection we have, Matt, we have about 100,000 documents. We have 2 world-class museums in Fort Worth, Dallas area. Right now, we're the only museum in the United States that has a signed document from every signer of the Declaration hanging on the wall as you walk in. We have all 56 there because we want them to know who these guys are. So when you look at these guys, what is striking is so many of them turned out to be governors. So many of them turned out to be national leaders. And one of the things that they did in their leadership role were they would issue proclamations for fasting, humiliation, and prayer, or for prayer and thanksgiving. The proclamations they issued aren't kind of, I mean, the one that Biden did on the National Day of Prayer is striking. That Biden followed federal law. He issued a proclamation for National Day of Prayer and never mentioned God or prayer anywhere in the proclamation. I mean, it's not that with the Founding Fathers. You get Jesus Christ very heavily in their proclamations, and they point to him as the Redeemer, as the Savior of mankind. They are unabashed and openly speaking about Jesus. And so there's so many you could point to, but that's a good way of starting. Is just go online and look at the proclamation. We have more than nearly 700 of their proclamations posted online on the website. Go look at the 22 proclamations by John Hancock and name any evangelical preacher in America who does a better job of setting forth the gospel than John Hancock does in his public proclamations for the state of Massachusetts. I'd challenge anyone to look at Hancock and find a preacher that's more evangelical than what John Hancock is in those proclamations. And it's the same with so many other governors and other signers as well. They're really quite evangelical.
Now, regarding Benjamin Franklin, he's the one who we actually can attribute a major turning point in America, where he stood up and said, the longer I live, the more convincing truths I see that God governs in the affairs of men. And how are we going to succeed any better than the builders of Babel if we do not pray to the God who brought us through the Civil War, the American Revolution? That doesn't sound like a deist. That sounds like somebody, whether you're not necessarily a Christian, he certainly believed in God, and he believed that God was governing in the affairs of this country. And what about Jefferson?
Yeah.
Jefferson also, he said that the Declaration was the reflection of the American mind, that idea of the God creator who endowed us with inalienable rights. That was preached from the pulpits.
It was preached from the pulpits. And with Franklin, you're right. And what I would challenge people to do, by the way, is if you consider Franklin the least religious, if that is the lowest bar you have to pass of the Founding Fathers, that particular call to prayer that he gave for the Constitutional Convention when things were falling apart, they had 5 weeks in the convention, it's not working. And he, of all people, is the one who calls them to prayer. And in that call to prayer, it's wonderful to read. It's the only speech at the Constitutional Convention that he personally gave. His other speeches, he would write out and give them to someone else and ask them to give the speech for him. So he wrote them all out. This one he gave is the only one he gave extemporarily. Every other speech he had written out. This one he did off the cuff. And when it was over and done with, Madison came to him and said, "Hey, can I get a copy of that from my notes?" Because Madison kept extensive notes. And so Franklin wrote out a copy of what he remembered that he said. And that's how we know what he said, is Franklin wrote it out himself. But what's amazing is in 14 sentences, calling them to prayer, he cites 14 different Bible verses by memory. And again, I don't know if any of us that would just suddenly start speaking Bible verses one after another, after another, after another. And you look at the Bible verses, and they're really what we would call obscure Bible verses. Maybe we know John 3:16 and a few other things. He's going through verses in Daniel. He's going through verses in Ecclesiastes and verses that we might not even think of. And that's our least religious founding father. And you take Jefferson as the other least religious. It's interesting to me just to see what Jefferson did with faith. People often say he was a man that was not a Christian and was not. He wanted separation of church and state. He wanted secular government. The problem with that is that Jefferson does have some writings late in life where that he questions some of his early Christian beliefs. He went through more tragedies than any of us want to go through. He lost his wife. He lost 5 of his 6 kids. He lost them young. And it just crushed him. He for months walked about in a daze. His daughter had to guide him around because he was so in a state of shock. And so it really affected him as, man, if God really loves me, how can I lose 5 kids and my wife? And so he had questions about some of his doctrines he had believed early on, but it never took him away from God. It just took him away from whether he fully believed every verse in the New Testament. And I don't mean to imply that he's not religious, because even after all this had happened, even after he's president of the United States, it's striking to me that he is the one who designed, he's the first one to be in the White House. So he's the guy who designed the plan of education for Washington, D.C. public schools. And he is the guy who put the Bible in as the primary reading text in Washington, D.C. public schools. So you're trying to tell me he's supposed to be a secular guy? And then on top of that, I look at what he did as president. He specifically appropriated money to preach the gospel to the Indians. Kaskaskia Indians is a great example. He gave money to send missionaries in. They asked for Catholic missionaries. He said, great, Catholic missionaries, go preach the gospel to Kaskaskia. He funded that as president of the United States. He also is a guy that when the Capitol building went up and the White House went up about the same time, he moved in 1800. And so same with the Capitol building, Congress moves in. On Sundays, they turned the Capitol building into a church building. And for 8 years, Jefferson went to church every Sunday at the U.S. Capitol. And he was considered a most faithful attendant there. And he actually was there when the first woman preached a sermon at the Capitol, Dorothy Ripley. He actually asked the Reverend John Leland to come preach there. Jefferson would ask preachers to come preach in the U.S. Capitol on Sundays. So, when people try to say, oh, he's not religious, well, maybe he's not as religious as John Hancock. But to suggest that he's anywhere close to secular or that he would tolerate secularism, no way, shape, fashion, or form. Did he agree with every doctrine of Christianity Orthodox? No, probably not. Not late in life. He did early on. But then again, that gives us Franklin and Jefferson. Try to find somebody else other than those two. Try to find somebody out of the other 54 who would go in the category of non-religious or non-evangelical. And it's very difficult to do.
Well, and it was early on, too, where he was part of writing the Declaration of Independence and doing the other things that he did earlier in his life before he had all those tragedies come upon him. So while he's in the midst of doing all of those documents and all the policies, that's the strongest time of his life for faith.
It was. And he was, excuse me, he was even governor at that time, 1779, shortly after the Declaration. And so he issued calls to prayer for the state of Virginia. Now, when he was president, he said, I don't think that's the role of the federal government to do religion. And people say, see, he wasn't religious because he didn't issue a proclamation. No, that's understanding the 10th Amendment in a different way than we understand it today. He thought it's appropriate, and it's appropriate for governors to do, and he did it as governor. So, yeah, Jefferson is one of the folks that they love to point to, but they never get all the facts right, even when they point to him. They pick the exceptions and not the rule, and then pick and choose from his life. So Jefferson, young in life, very, very strong in his faith.
Well, David, I know you and WallBuilders and your team are involved in America 250. Tell us a little bit about what's happening, what you're doing with America 250. What can people expect in 2026, and how can they get involved, learn more?
What I really like about America 250 is while there is federal involvement, they're really trying to push us down in the state level. And there's several hundred partners that they're working with. We're specifically working with the Department of Education, others, but there's about 200 partners. So we'll be doing, I think there's about 37 events left to do in states on the 250th. And so what we do is we'll take a lot of those original artifacts of the states. They have big gatherings. But then there's so many other groups doing events across the United States, and what they're asking, and that's what the federal guys are asking for, is we need thousands and thousands and thousands of events. We need them in every state in the United States. And so there are some cool ones coming off, like there's one we're doing at Ellis Island, and there's one we're doing the USS Midway, World War II ship. So there's great events that'll be seen, and this is only the second time that the federal government has passed a law allowing the Washington Monument to be used for projection images on the side. And that's going on now. And that's super cool. So it's a really big thing. Anybody who saw the 250th anniversary of the Army, that parade, that celebration, that was a big deal. And there's going to be stuff like that going on across the nation. So we're participating in dozens and dozens and dozens of these events across the country. And man, if there's not something going in your community, set up something in your community. Set up a 250th celebration. Get some people in, get them together. Everybody needs to be celebrating this, because this has never been done in the history of the world. What America has done, this is worth celebrating for sure.
David, in the final concluding moments, what would you like to share with our viewers?
On the 50th anniversary of the Declaration is when John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died. Out of the 56 signers, there were 3 left on the 50th anniversary. And after Jefferson and Adams died the same day, within 3 hours of each other, it left Charles Carroll of Carrollton as the final surviving signer of the Declaration. He's out of Maryland, a signer out of Maryland. And at that point, New York City said, hey, we have an original copy of the Declaration. And there were very, very few. They said, you're the last surviving signer. We're going to send that to you. Would you write your sentiments on it? And so he did. And so this is in New York City. I think the public library has his declaration now there. But he said, I'm grateful for all the blessings that Jesus Christ, our Lord, has conferred upon our blessed country. And when you read the final signer of the Declaration, the final statement made by a signer of the Declaration, written on the Declaration of Independence, invoking Jesus Christ and the blessings that he's given to America as the reason we are who we are, I think that's a great ending place for the faith of signers of the Declaration. And again, individually, we go through them on the website. People can see that. But from start to finish, as you pointed out, what Jefferson wrote there at the start, at the very beginning, all the way through the last statement by the last sign of the Declaration, written on the Declaration of Independence, being about Jesus Christ, it's a really good capstone, beginning and end for the Declaration.
That's a great way to consider America 250 in 2026 as we celebrate the real reason for our freedom, which is the freedom that we have in Jesus Christ that gives birth to the body politic that we call the United States of America. And of course, churches, pastors, leaders continue to lead in prayer. I know President Donald Trump has urged a regular weekly prayer for America. There's a lot of resources for you to follow on that as well. David, thank you for joining us. You can go to WallBuilders.com, WallBuilders.com, and WallBuilders for information about not only this, but so many other things about the amazing history of America. Thank you for joining us, David.
Matt, we appreciate you and all you do. God bless you, brother.
God bless.
Matt, David Barton again sets us straight with the facts. And how far have we drifted, right? When you think about it, 55 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, at least, maybe all 56, were Christians. But no one understands that or even is aware of it.
And even Benjamin Franklin.
Yeah.
His statements are more religious than most people that
he would be
say themselves are religious today.
Yeah.
You know, when you read his words at the conventions that ultimately was the pivotal moment that changed America and why we have America, when he stood up and he had that extemporaneous discussion about God and prayer.
14 verses.
14 verses in 14 sentences. Had, you know, that are some of those are obscure verses. Exactly. He knew the Bible very well. He knew it more than maybe many preachers might know the Bible in some respects because he was a well-versed man. The amazing thing is that when you have 56 founders like that, and you have 55 or even 54, if you wanted to say Jefferson doesn't fall in that category. That's a huge percentage. And even Jefferson and Franklin, they understood that there's a God. He endows us with our rights, and government's duty is to protect those rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yeah. And that's the fundamental basis of America, and that's what makes America great.
Yeah, it really does feel like for such a time as this opportunity for our country, and I'm very thankful. In closing, remember 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, which says, all Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness. Our freedom is a gift from our Creator. We must never forget that and always protect it. Join us here next time. You'll hear victories as well as ways you can stand up for your priceless freedom. Join us again for Freedom Alive.